Perfect. Well, I want to thank everybody for joining us for our September EAPK webinar. And tonight we have David Scales, the new executive director for NSIP. Just a couple of housekeeping items. You can go ahead and mute yourself. We're going to have a lot of, while David's talking, we're going to have a lot of Q&A, I hope. So I hope you came with your questions. Format tonight's going to be a little bit different. Asked David if he could share just a little bit of background about himself, involvement with NSIP, and kind of what the role looks like moving forward, and then wanted to provide plenty of time to put him out in front of people within the industry and be able to ask questions and almost treat this kind of like an open house and get those questions answered and just get to know the person that you're calling and emailing a little bit more when you do have those NSIP type questions. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to David and tell us a little bit about yourself.
All right. Well, excellent. It's a pleasure to be here tonight. I appreciate you guys having me. Obviously, my name is David Scales. I've been a native of Michigan most of my life. I have spent a little bit of time living out of the state at different times. I actually grew up in northern Michigan. I grew up in Michigan's Upper Peninsula. My folks still have a farm there. Had some form of purebred livestock around ever since I was knee-high. Mom and dad still operate a purebred Simmental and Angus herd, about 60 cow-calf pairs. And they were already developing it while I was young, but it's certainly grown, I'd say, within the last 10 years. They retain most of their calves out of that and feed them out themselves and market them in freezer packages. I would say this year, I think last time I heard from my mother, they'll have about 25 of those to market this year, along with keeping some replacement heifers and whatnot. And as I mentioned, those are almost all seed stock type cattle produced from an Angus Simmental based herd. We still try to maintain some registration papers on those. And so utilizing EPDs and things were part of my upbringing, I suppose you could say, because those were always things that we did keep in mind while we were making keep cull decisions there as well. We were always kind of enrolled with some of that. Growing up, always involved with livestock and leadership opportunities with 4-H and such. We showed some livestock. My sister and I, we'd haul cattle to the North American International Livestock Expo. Won a few classes down there. Actually had the Reserve Spring Bowl in the Angus division in 2014 in the Open Show. So that was kind of fun. It's still maintained, always had a hobby flock of sheep there as well from a weather sheep standpoint. And so we've continued to maintain them. We also used to run some commercial sheep. They were largely poly-paid Dorset influenced sheep at that time. And we would try to utilize some NSIP bucks in there as well. So I guess you could say we've always sort of been end users of NSIP sheep, utilizing EBVs that way. At one point in time, that commercial flock got up to around 120. And then just as I was going away to school and my sister was going away to school, as the labor force kind of shrunk, something had to give way. And the commercial flock was what it was. And so we dispersed those. Now, I'll probably get to be about 5 or 6 years ago now. When I stepped off and went to college, I went to Michigan State University. That was always a goal that I had in mind is going through high school. Everyone asked me what I wanted to do. I wanted to go to Michigan State University. I wanted to major in animal science, and I wanted to live at one of the teaching facilities there, one of the farms. And so I managed to make all of those goals come true. I lived for a year at the Sheep Teaching and Research Center there, which is where I got more exposure as well to NSIP, largely due to the manager there at the time was Al Cullum. We had two pretty, I would say, mainstream NSIP flocks with the Suffolks and the Dorsets that they were running at that time. And so that's where I continued to get my feet wet and gain a greater understanding of utilizing EBV selection and things of that nature. Was involved with research while I was at Michigan State. I was a presenter at the 2017 Midwest Animal Science meetings. That was actually on the hog side of things. I had a pretty fun internship at Schwartz Farms in Minnesota. That's a hog operation. They own 60,000 sows. And we're pushing at that time about 1.25 million hogs out the door every year. And so certainly learned a lot about efficiencies of capturing the efficiencies of scale um, and trying to maintain a supply flow, I guess I should say, as we marketed hogs all the way through the year while I worked for those folks. But I had a fun opportunity to take on a bit of a very applied research project concerning energy supplementation in baby pigs. And so we brought that research home. We had worked with over 1,500 baby pigs on that. Brought that research back to Michigan State. Dr. Gretchen Hill helped me compile it into a good abstract, and it got accepted. We put it into a presentation and presented on it. We gave it a fancy name of energy supplementation in neonatal pigs. So that was something I was involved in there. I was also involved with some research that Dr. Hill was doing concerning zinc supplementation in young hogs as well. And so even though pigs aren't my main species by any stretch of the imagination, I would say I'm somewhat influenced by that industry as well. Once I moved on from Michigan State, I went to Reproduction Specialty Group in Lebanon, Indiana, with Dr. Tad Thompson and an international team of vets that specialize, obviously, in reproduction of small ruminants. The year that I worked for them, we bred over 10,000 sheep in-house. I was the flock manager and assistant farm manager. And so we were responsible at that time for about 220 donor animals that were sent to us from clients across the country. And we were maintaining a recip flock at that time, around 1,500 head. And so we keeping those on file to put embryos in for those clients, and we would sell them as pregnant recipients, if we could, and when we did get them confirmed pregnant. And that was an excellent opportunity, a fun time of my life, really getting to experience working with a relatively large group of sheep in the Midwest, mostly in we were not doing a whole lot of rotational grazing or anything at that time, mostly in a dry lot situation. But anyway, skipping ahead, I wanted to get back to Michigan. That was home for me. And the opportunity came about to return to continue working with purebred livestock at Wheaton Hampshires here in Charlotte, Michigan, which is where I've been, I guess, since February of 2018. So I don't know, 6 or 7 years or so now, I suppose. And so I've been heavily involved with, obviously, the purebred sheep production here, Hampshire sheep. They've had them since 1919. Really kind of ride the cutting edge of reproductive technology here. Leland was one of the first guys to really kind of latch on to AI and embryo transfer in sheep as a way to drive genetic progress. And so we still do so today. But last time I kind of cranked the numbers, roughly 80% of our lamb crop is a product of artificial insemination or embryo transfer. And so we still run 4 or 5 programs a year through here. So some of the same things I did and learned while I was at Reproduction Specialty Group are still things that I carried out at Wheaton Hampshires. We operate roughly 80 head of purebred Hampshire ewes and then about 120 to 140 recipient ewes. And there again, as on those recipient ewes, we kind of step in as an end user of NSIP rams. And we've purchased some Dorset bucks from Virginia Tech, some Dorset bucks as well from North Carolina State. And we've been utilizing those. Joe, gosh, I cannot think of his name. He's the dean now at South Dakota State University. We purchased polypay rams through him as well. But all of those were NSIP bucks and all sheep that carried, a good profile and numbers to go along with them. So that's how over the last several years, how we've continued to develop that recip flock. So I guess you can say that from a standpoint of being an end user of NSIP, I have a fair amount of experience. So that kind of brings us up to this point now. I'm excited to step in as the new executive director, still kind of getting my feet wet with it. I've only really been in the role since July 8th, and there was certainly for a while, it's a little bit like drinking from a fire hose, so to speak. So everything is just continuing to get familiarized with the process and continue to get more familiar with the producers themselves. Kind of a goal of mine moving forward is to continue to grow NSIP. Something that I've said in the past and that I firmly believe is that I want to continue to work at this until we don't have to introduce ourselves anymore, and that we kind of become a household name, not just with purebred producers, but with commercial producers as well, because I truly look at this as somewhat of a bottom up promotional scheme, in my opinion, that if we can continue to draw more end users of NSIP in and drive demand for the seed stock sheep that we have in the program already, I think that we can really kind of put our foot on the pedal, so to speak, in terms of growth. And so if we have that market available, I think we'll it just makes selling the program to new producers even easier. And so that's probably more of my background than you guys ever really wanted to know. That's kind of a quick 1,000-foot elevator speech of my goals for the National Sheep Improvement Program. I guess I'd love to kind of stimulate some discussion if we can.
Yeah, I've got a couple of questions just to get the ball rolling. First of all, appreciate the background. I think it's important as we have questions or we're communicating via email over the phone that David Scales is a human being and a real person. And so he's right here in front of you tonight. And so just knowing some of that background, I think I enjoy it. I think it's helpful. But a couple of questions I have to get started and get the ball rolling. Just overall vision for NSIP. We've seen growth. I know that's been talked about at previous meetings at ASI. How do we continue, or I guess that's kind of pushing you into a direction, but what's vision overall?
Well, again, like I say, when I think of the future of NSIP, you know, there's a vast percentage of commercial producers that are buying rams without data. And so they're really kind of just taking a stab in the dark of what these rams can do for them. And so I think as we continue to, I think a big step that needs to be taken is outreach and education to the end users of NSIP and be able to draw. To me, I'm kind of a hard facts kind of guy. I like having something in front of me that I can look at. So I love partial budgets. I mean, I'll put partial budgets together if someone would give me some statistics on how to do so on the number of face flies that are buzzing around a group of sheep. You know, if that can be something that can make an economic change by, you know, fighting off face flies, then hey, that might be something that we're interested in implementing. And so I think a lot of times that the reasons folks make decisions is, you know, we can talk a lot about how utilizing NSIP is for the service of, you know, feeding the world, basically. So it's really kind of a noble purpose. I mean, all of us are involved in agriculture. I think it's a very noble profession, going all the way back to the times of George Washington, who called it exactly that. Um, but at the end of the day, as producers and as business people as well, we have to be economically minded. And so if we can put a partial budget together of how utilizing a RAM or a certain set of RAMs is going to positively impact our bottom line, I think that makes it a lot easier to take that step and say, you know what? We can't afford not to be using these RAMs that have the data to back up the kind of performance we want and need out of our future lamb crop.
Awesome. Next question I've got, you touched a little bit on
Can
wanting.
I was just gonna throw something in, Jim Morgan here.
Yeah, go for it, Jim.
So you should, you know, one of the things you'll run into is the Leading Edge project in Utah, and they did use NSIP rams and non-NSIP suffix on a Ramblay flock in Utah, and did get some data back. So at some point, David, you should look at that. It, I mean, they were making like $5 more per lamb or something like that. You know, using it. There was a couple of the industry rams selected other ways that were just as good, but you know, 5 out of 80% of the time, the NSIP rams were better than other rams. So
Right.
Okay.
I do remember hearing about that project, and you're right. I do need to take a little more time to dig right through the nuts and bolts of that, because I've only ever just heard about it and understood the premise of what was going on there, and I knew that the NSIP bucks had performed favorably, or as we expected them to. But yeah, that's a good point. Thank you.
And it hasn't been done with hair sheep, so that'd be something of interest to us. So
sure.
All right.
Yeah, I believe that project too was a terminally sired project. So Suffolk Rams on top of fine wool ewes out west.
I think if I remember right, I think they had some high growth Suffolk Rams. They had high eye muscle depth Suffolk
Yep.
Rams, and then they had Rams that were just selected essentially phenotypically using traditional methods, I suppose, and compared those batches of lambs to each other.
But they allowed the Western Ram producers who claim that their sheep were better than NSIP sheep to select some animals to go in. So those were the phenotypic. Those would have been phenotypic and Western adapted. But anyway, enough on that. Let's go ahead and move on. Sorry, I just thought that
no, not at all. That's a very good point, and I appreciate it, because to me those are the kinds of projects we need to get in front of people and be able to draw some of, when we start talking about putting together a partial budget, it's to show economic change, because I think that's really, at the end of the day, when we think of this from a business standpoint, that's a reason people make a change in their management decisions. And so, if it's significant, like you're making $5 a head more when you're talking about thousands of lambs, it's really kind of a no-brainer. You can't afford not to be using Rams with some data.
Yeah, do not apologize for the question or the comment. That's what tonight is about. So it's very much appreciated. The only other question I've got to start us off is you'd mentioned making NSIP a household name. What does that mean to you, and what are the strategies that yourself and us as NSIP participants can work towards to make that happen?
Well, sure. So there again, I think a lot of this comes back from being able to utilize some outreach to get in front of people. I think I remember the statistic Andrew Weaver was and I were talking about is the percentage of sheep flocks in the country that are not utilizing NSIP rams versus the ones that are. As much as we talk about NSIP and are absorbed with the utilization of EBVs for selection decisions, there's a huge subset of the industry that doesn't even really know that we're doing it, that doesn't know that this is a terrific tool that exists. And so I think to make ourselves a household name is just exactly that, is that and I don't think it's just on the purebred side of things either. Certainly we want to reach out to more purebred producers and pull more purebred producers in. But I truly do believe that the way forward is not just focusing on the purebred guys, but paying attention maybe, I think, to the commercial producer as well. And this is maybe a little bit of a bottom-up type of recruitment process. But if we draw more and more commercial guys in, and get them familiarized with the program and get them to where they're comfortable that this data works, this tool is accurate, these numbers aren't magic, that this is all rooted in science, then I think that by continuing getting them to buy in, and so but from one standpoint, just becoming familiar with the program and knowing what our name is and knowing what we stand for and what we're working on, that's the hump there. And so however that comes about, I mean, I'm just trying to think of ways that, moving forward, and obviously it's still early on in this process, but I'm trying to think of ways that I can get these kind of good word and like examples like the Leading Edge project, get that into as many types of publications as I can so people can read it and get them thinking to themselves, maybe this is something I should look into further. I think as producers, as all of us as a whole, I think, I don't want to try to be the person that wants to shove anything down anybody's throat or tell them the kind of sheep they should be raising or shouldn't be raising. I just want to be able to kind of consistently deliver the facts of that, if you were, for me, it's, I'm a Midwest kid. It's easy for me to always conceptualize these things into pounds. If you can add a few more pounds to your lamb crop, what is that worth overall? Or if you're in a feedlot situation, if you can remove a few days, so, in 130 pounds, say, is your target weight, maybe that's high. I don't care if it's 100 pounds, whatever it might be. But, if you can remove, say, 7 or 8 days from the whole feeding process, well, if you're in a feedlot situation where you're feeding 3,000 or 4,000 lambs, the removal of 7 days is a substantial change to your bottom line. And so kind of stepping into that role of I guess just educating people that this is a real tool that can change your program from a financial standpoint, I think is a huge step forward in helping drive demand for Rams and use for that matter, but stock that have EBVs backing them and data backing them. And if we can drive the demand for that, and folks are willing to pay a premium for that information, well, then all of a sudden, I think it becomes a lot easier on the purebred side of things to recruit people because, if Cam and I are both raising, say, Suffolk Rams or something, and Cam's enrolled and I'm not, and his Suffolk Rams, are selling for an average of $400, $500, $600 more than mine. It's not going to take me very long to look down the road and say, well, goodness, I want to break into that same market Cam is in. And so, to me, the way that we get more purebred producers to join us is by having more commercial producers demanding that the Rams they use have that kind of information. And to do that, I think just continues to be a willingness to write the articles, to send out the pamphlets, to step up and meet people at whether it be at sales or wherever it might be, and just kind of continue to deliver the information that this tool exists and this tool works.
I have a question.
Yes.
Have you ever considered going forward and you talk about getting the information out there and you talk about using magazines, which are kind of antiquated a little bit. What
Sure.
about social media? I mean, have you guys considered doing more, little bits of information at a time on social media? Because then people who are in NSIP can also copy and paste that and put it to their groups to get that information out there more readily through the social media aspect.
So yeah, and so certainly so social media is definitely something that, whether you love it or hate it is certainly something that we interact with and deal with on a daily basis. And so it's that you're exactly right, that can't be ignored. And so certainly when I talk about publications or partial budgets, that is something that's in the back of my mind, as well as being able to maybe break that into digestible chunks that people can look at and read in not a split second, but I don't know how you guys use social media, but for me anymore, it's really the type of thing is that maybe as I eat a meal or, waiting on a phone call or something, you end up kind of scrolling. And so it has to be something that I don't think you get pulled into and are going to read paragraph upon paragraph on a social media from a social media standpoint. But I think that you raise a good point, and that's a good idea of being able to have something that can be taken in and digested relatively quickly, say in a minute or a minute and a half, and then folks move on. But have it be something that, solid facts that folks can remember and recall relatively quickly, and maybe hopefully in the future too, get them to reach back out, and as they search for it, draw them to a website or something a little more concrete.
I agree. I think that more information can get out to more people. Like you got to break it down to chunks. Like if they're not going to spend a lot of time on it, it can just be brief stuff like, would you ever buy a car without looking under the hood? Why buy your sheet that way? Stuff like that. And then lead them to a web page, whatever.
Sure. No, I agree. That's a good sound bite there. We might need to be need to tap you for that a little bit further on.
Hello,
I'd be
David.
willing to help.
Hello, David. Can you hear me?
I can.
I'm Joan Burke. I just got back from invited presentation at the University of Florida. There are 100 plus producers. About 2% of them knew what NSIP was. So you're making a household name in Florida is sorely needed, especially for parasite resistance in Florida. But also, and maybe this is beyond the scope of this webinar, but I don't know how we address people who don't know about NSIP and then goat producers. Goat producers have so much to gain by doing genotype data management rather than just phenotype.
Well, sure. And so I don't mean to discount the goat producers at all. Matter of fact, I just had a good conversation with a goat producer from Texas earlier today. Her name was Christina Ballard. And I agree. I think the goats are maybe a little bit of an overlooked segment of what we can do. When you also look at it from the goat standpoint, we don't have a bunch of those enrolled right now. And so, I certainly think the genotyping and furthering the goat population that way would be an excellent thing to pursue in the future. But man, if it's a difference between getting one more flock to start genotyping and a difference between getting one more flock to start recording weaning weights and post weaning weights, I think they stand a lot to gain right now from that standpoint, just as small a population as they are that's currently enrolled, just getting more people involved recording those physical traits like that we can start to develop that population and hopefully further down the road get them to step forward and continue on with the genotyping as well. But no, I appreciate that stat that, in a room of 100 people, not very many of them know. And I'm not saying this is going to be a process that we're going to be able to enact a change in 6 months. It might not be I want to continue to developing our brand and that was a good point that was made earlier, utilizing social media, being able to utilize these research projects like the Leading Edge and things. I think those are all good points that are being made. I'm not gonna. I understand that we're working uphill on this, and so I'm not gonna say or promise that we're going to have it's going to be a change that we're going to notice in 6 months. It might not be a change that we're going to notice in the first year, but it is something that I want to continue working towards. And so, like JFK said a long, long time ago, he said, "Let us begin."
I did show him several of our plots from the ARS block showing, what a huge difference it makes when you start using the EBVs, and hopefully at least some of them grasped it and are going to be interested in it. So hopefully I touched somebody in that group of people.
Right. Well, and I think, Cam mentioned earlier is what can we all do as individual producers to try to keep facilitating our brand as a household name. And I think exactly what you've done there is, if people don't know, they don't know, and you can't research what you don't know or you have never heard of. And so even if it's something that we can mention, even in passing, if it's something that we can spark some interest to do a quick Google search, and then they can maybe find some further documentation from that. I think those are things that we can all do as we interact with our fellow producers and rub shoulders at producer meetings or run into folks at the feed mill or wherever we might be. I think those are all things that can help, that really can make a difference.
Yeah, and Joan, I've seen those graphs and the multiple trait selection of parasite resistance, and then saying, oh, we need some prolificacy and maternal power in these sheep, and then just long-term selection. Those are very impactful. And so I hope you had a lot of positive response. I do think even the household name aspect of it, just to get producers to know what it is, whether they're participating in it or not. I feel like once they know what it is, it's hard not to at least be intrigued in wanting to participate. And it is very much a the southeast portion of the US, a lot of new producers. And I know NC State had a survey that very similar statistics that you had mentioned on just lack of, don't even know what it is, had never heard of it before. So I think that's a important push.
Yeah, and I told him, I said, from trying to do parasitology research, once we started using those EBVs, we got to the point where we couldn't do the parasitology research, and still it's quite difficult, which is good for farmers, bad for researchers. But anyway, thanks, Cam.
Anybody else have some questions in here? I do think, the group in and of itself and EAPK and kind of the foundation that it sits on, we take it for granted just what NSIP is and our involvement, and it's just kind of second nature. But to the rest of the industry, it can be somewhat foreign.
There's a couple comments that should be addressed.
Oh yeah, here in the chat. So better software and
Yeah.
faster DSU processing time would be a good way to attract and keep members.
And I don't disagree with that. And so we did take a pause this year in the processing of TSUs to try to sort through and essentially try to identify and eliminate some bottlenecks that are associated with that process. And what it comes down to a little bit is when we start getting hit with a lot of those all at once, it is a time-consuming process. And so I think one thing that we did look at moving forward is the possibility of needing to bring in some part-time help to be able to process those TSUs just as they hit the executive director's desk, to effectively get those mailed to Neogen in a timely manner, and just to avoid being completely buried underneath those when they arrive, because they are somewhat time-consuming to process. And whether we like it or not, something that can be done on the producer side to help ease that process is to double check your own records before you send them in, because we get a bunch of duplicates quite often. We also sometimes get people that will send, and it's a lot of times it's a simple mistake, but there's those that all slows down when we can mail that out. And so it would be great to be able to, when you've got a big batch of them setting, to send them. But if you're waiting to fix one or two edits that an individual producer might have, and you've got more of them kind of backing up behind you, that's something that can be done at the producer level to help ease that as well. But that is something that as an executive committee, I think we've all discussed and maybe agreed upon that it's because of how well it has been received, it's probably grown faster than any of them at the time when they made that decision to move forward with it believed it could grow at. That's at least the continual message that I hear back from folks on the executive committee as I discuss this with them, is that the growth and the reception has been tremendous, but because of that, we didn't quite anticipate the workload that would be coming and be associated with that. And so I think that we're caught up now, and I think that as folks are sending them now, they're being mailed in a timely manner. And to me, something that we're going to do to try to overcome that is we're certainly going to look into the hiring of some part-time help during the busy portions of the year to be able to effectively process those TSUs, so they're not essentially sitting on a desk awaiting processing. We can at least get through them and can get them mailed to Neogen, because it does appear that once they get to Neogen, we can get them back in a 60 to 90-day window pretty readily. It's getting them to them that causes the issues there. And every now and again, there is some holdups once stuff gets to Australia, but getting all the samples back at one time. Occasionally, they'll only send a full plate, and I can't remember exactly how many go on a plate, but every now and again, you'll get a producer that will end up with part of them on a plate that'll go and part of them on a plate that has to wait. And so you're kind of set back, an additional, 15, 20 days, whatever it may be. As far as the better software goes, I think there again, I agree, that's something that as I continue to talk to producers, and like I say, I'm still pretty green and new at this, but that's one thing that I've continually heard brought up again and again and again there as well, is that the system we're using is antiquated and can be difficult to utilize. And so, not to say this is not a solution yet, but there's been some talks with Scott Boderidge at West Virginia of potentially having some grad students that are looking for some assistantships, of where folks can record their raw data at home and for a nominal fee can send that data to these grad students or these folks and have them implement that data into Lamb Plan and Pedigree Master for them. And I think looking forward, that might be a potential solution, at least to kind of bridge us along here for a while until, maybe in the future we can find another interface that we want to utilize. But for now, I think we've got what we've got, and trying to find ways to better utilize that rather than look for an entirely new system, I think is the way forward, at least in the nearsighted future. I see here gene check can turn around your samples. If you can get your gene check samples turned around in 3 days, that's pretty darn impressive because we utilize gene check here as well. And I mean, I just don't think they can get mailed out there in 3 days. Um, but I mean, certainly they can have it back to you within a week. There's no doubt about that. Um, and so, gene check isn't giving quite the same amount of information, though, I don't think either as the test that we're running when we come back from Neogen either. So certainly if you're making keep cold decisions based on things like just strict or like for sale information, trying to get information on scrapey info, gene check can be an option as well. I'm not going to say that they can't be. And they're within this country. It's a lot, just getting to them is a heck of a lot quicker.
Hi, David. This is Becky Phillips. I just have a quick question. Are you fielding questions yet?
I am, yeah.
Well, I have questions, individual questions on my last report that I would meet with at some point. I just didn't know if you were up for that yet.
I think I saw your email a few days ago, right?
Yeah, I sent it. Yeah, it's been a few days, but I was wondering. I didn't know if I jumped the gun or not.
No, I'm certainly fielding questions, although like I won't stand here and pretend to you guys that I have all the answers yet. And so I'm not too proud. So a lot of times what ends up happening is if it's a question that I can't answer, I pass it around to a few other members of the executive committee. If it's something that's beyond them, then I have to reach out to some of the higher ups at Lamb Plan across the pond. And so sometimes that just the nature of the timing differences between United States and Australia, like for example, those guys are just getting to work right now. Can facilitate a little bit of a difficulty sometimes in communicating back and forth via email chains with those guys.
Sure. Okay.
Do have a question in the chat here. To help us better understand EBV scores, would there be any possibility of providing mean and standard deviation measures?
So I think that from a certain standpoint, we're getting close to that. So there is an ongoing project right now from a grant that we applied for last year to update the searchable database in NSIP. And one of those improvements that we're going to utilize is a bar graph that does show where the sheep set as compared to the average of the entire breed. And so I think that bar graph does a pretty good job of showing that, David. It's not up and running yet. I just got but we're close. I would say we're within 30 days of having that posted.
So is that the mean EBV for that trait, or is that the mean raw thing? Is that what David was wanting? I know the accuracy, and there's ways to get from accuracy to standard deviation.
Sure. And so accuracy numbers are going to be, I know for a fact, accuracy numbers are going to be present on those bar graphs. And then essentially that bar graph is going to show you where you're sitting in terms of percentiles down to within 5%.
Yeah, I understood it as the actual EBV versus the raw portion of that.
Yes, it is. It's the EBV, not the raw pounds.
Yeah, and that was bar graph would certainly be convenient. My like immediate reaction to that was and maybe you have to flip to the other page or hold up your percentile report to that, but it is nice to compare those EBVs against that percentile report for the breed averages and find out where they fall. And then he had commented, I mean the individual EBV score. All right. Any other questions in here? With this group, we've got to have something.
I have a question, but it's more of a personal question, but I'll go ahead and ask it since no one's asking any questions. I have a sheep that I've submitted the genomic, the DNA information for, but it's not, when I get the report back from pet, when I sent out my EBVs, it doesn't have that little square that shows it actually got recorded as a genomic enhanced EBVs. So do I need to send you to look into it? Do you need the original DNA tube number, or do you just need the NSIP number, or both? Does that make sense what I'm
So-
asking?
So you're just saying that you know for a fact that sheep has been tested, but it's not showing up in the searchable database as though it's as though he's been genomically enhanced?
Yes, I mean, I got the data back on, the codon, the parentage. I got all that information back. It's just not showing up
Where,
that
which
has
which
enhanced.
platform is it not showing up in? Is it not showing up in Pedigree Master? Is it not showing up on the searchable database on the NSIP website, or where are you? Both. Okay. Well, if you want to, if you could send me your flock ID and then the NSIP ID of that particular sheep, I will send that across. To me, that sounds like a Stephen Fields question. So I will send that across and ask him on that one.
I used to send that information to Rusty, but I don't know what he used to do with it. But I didn't know if you needed, we'll find the actual DNA tube number if that would be helpful.
Marty, what's the date of your report? Have you gotten a recent report?
Oh, yeah, I've already got the report. I didn't realize it didn't get recorded. But I submitted it. Oh, it's probably been a year ago. But I've already gotten all the information back on, everything I need to know about the sheep, except for it's not showing up that it was when I do an NSIP search or on the information I get back from, Australia. It's not showing that has been tested.
Sure. So it sounds like it might be just a clerical error to me. But if you can send over some of that relevant information, we'll send that
Okay.
across to Stephen Fields or Mel Dowling at Sheep DNA over there and see if they might not be able to shed a little light on that. But it sounds like that might be just a simple clerical error to me, especially considering you've already gotten back
All the data, yeah.
all of the information. So I think that's probably a pretty simple quick fix.
Okay, I'll send it to you.
Thank you.
Thanks for your time this evening, David. John Mazer. One of the programs that I know a number of us benefited from was that first Wednesday at noon kind of open question session held on Zoom. Do you see that being reinstated here in the next couple of months?
I think it's something that we certainly could talk about reinstating. Yeah. It's just been one of those things that is kind of as we've gone through this transitionary period and started to talk about things that are so word I guess I'm looking for, vital for keeping the lights on and things that we could put by the wayside. That was one of those things that we just set aside for now.
Sure.
If that's something that as producers you guys found exceptionally useful, then I think it's something that we certainly could bring back.
Yeah, I think it gave us the ability, it served a couple of functions. One was it was an educational program that helped to really kind of, if you will, EBVs 201, kind of an upper level opportunity to take a look at EBVs. And it also was a good opportunity to kind of share some experiences that different flock managers have had experienced. So yeah, I personally thought there was a lot of benefit. It was a really good outreach, one of the few outreaches to the general membership that I think NSIP has in place.
Okay. Yeah, certainly it's something we can talk about, that's for sure. One thing I think we should stay conscious of, we talk about I think it's good that as producers get more experience, they start to bounce ideas off of each other and really kind of dig into the nuts and bolts of things. I want to be careful that as we get into some of those conversations that we don't scare new members off with the depth of some of our conversations either. I think that needs to be kept in mind too. Is I think when that was developed, it was in mind of the new producer with some frequently asked questions that just needed a little face-to-face guidance. And so I think we just, as all of us as experienced producers as well, should keep that in mind and try to be able to offer a helping hand whenever we can. Because like you say, there's no sense in reinventing the wheel. If it was a struggle that maybe you went through as a new producer, and you can help somebody that's just starting out avoid some of those same pitfalls, I think there's a lot of value in that. So thanks for bringing that up, John.
Yeah, and one of the values, at least what I thought was fun about that session, was it was across breeds. And so, like this
Sure.
group specifically, we tend to talk about Katahdin sheep and get very specific on that side of things. It was kind of interesting to hear, someone who was raising polypays or Suffolks, an issue that they ran into, and in that production environment, like, oh, I wouldn't have thought about that. If I run into that issue, I can troubleshoot it now. But the topics and discussion was pretty high level in a lot of those meetings. So yeah, good comments, John. Anybody else have some more good questions?
So to go back and answer a question in the chat, it was asked here, I think, is that compared to an average of all lambs reported in that year, the average of all animals in NSIP for the breed ever. I think it's the answer to that is that it's an average for animals that are active in NSIP. And so if obviously I think if they've been culled or reported as dead or something, I don't think that those numbers are taken into account when we look at them on that bar graph.
Anybody else? If not, I can just keep spitting questions at you till we come up to our hour. But you talked a lot about commercial and kind of bottom up mentality, which I think is something we can easily lose sight of when we're swapping rams back and forth and just get lost in the data in a good way. But really, how do we promote within that commercial industry and make it a necessity within that group? How do you create a culture of that bottom up, that commercial industry up mentality?
I guess are you talking about how we build that within the commercial producers themselves? Or are you talking about how as purebred producers we kind of keep the commercial segment in mind as we're making decisions?
Well, if you want to answer both, that would be good. Because I think the second part of that, how do we keep the commercial producer in mind? Is probably more what I was geared at.
So I think as producers, I mean, something that we need to keep in mind is producers are going to, this is going to be something that's going to take us some time as an industry as a whole, is folks have been used to purchasing sheep based on phenotype for quite a long time. And there is still, I mean, if like I mentioned, I'm a member of the Angus Association. I'm a member of the Simmental Association. And so I get their monthly publications, the Angus Journal and the Simmental Register. And so we poke a little fun, I guess, at myself, as this is how old a soul I am, is I still like to flip through the magazines. And if I come across a solid article, I like to take a second to read through it. And particularly, I like to read through some of these guys that have really found a way to take data and efficiencies to the next level. There was one just the other day here in the Simmental Register, probably sitting on my kitchen table if I looked around hard for it. And something that still comes back. And so this is a guy that has been utilizing EPDs in his cattle operation for almost 30 years. And his kids are doing some of the same things. They're all involved, still on the farm. A North Carolina producer, matter of fact. What was his name? Maybe some of you folks down in North Carolina might know him. Can't remember where I put that magazine, but regardless, it's funny is that with as many indexes as he has to draw from, there were still some certain phenotypic traits that he considered non-negotiable. He called them non-negotiable. And some of that included things like foot angle. Some of that included things like just soundness. He called it doability, which for me, from a stockmanship standpoint, doability is just the ability to thrive in his environment. And so for whatever that might mean to him, it means different things for different people. But so I think it's important to remember that no matter how much information we collect and how many partial budgets we put together for folks, at the end of the day, if a producer walks in, he still can't find a sheep he likes, he still may not be willing to buy one. And so I think we need to keep in mind of what the commercial producer wants out of his sheep. And so he wants ewes that are going to breed easy. He wants ewes that are efficient. He wants ewes that are probably parasite resistant. Sheep that breed back on time, sheep that breed early. I think those are all things that really kind of check the boxes. I think he wants sheep that offer the kind of maternal shape of body that suggests that they're going to be good doers. And so I think that's something that we need to keep in mind too, is that if a producer can walk in and find a sheep that he likes, and then the numbers and the data are all going to suggest that sheep's also going to work, I think it becomes a slam dunk. And so that to me is something we need to keep in mind from the commercial guy standpoint, is that, hey, they've been used to buying sheep utilizing their eye for a long time. And so we need to keep that in mind just a little bit as we continue to educate them and bring them around to a more data-based format for selection making decisions as well. And so I do think it's interesting though to go back and see that I've mentioned before, and I'll say this again, and you'll probably hear me say it again in the future, is that I don't ever mean to reinvent the wheel. Some of the same growing pains that we're going through as an industry are some of the same growing pains that the cattle industry would have gone through in like the 80s and 90s as they moved to a more data-based selection system as well. And so I think that by blindfolding ourselves and looking and sometimes getting lost just strictly in the sheep industry, we're losing some great examples that have been set for us by other ruminant industries around us.
I really like that answer. Yeah, because a lot of those things that you listed off, we can look at a piece of paper and make improvements from the commercial industry and find rams that fix a lot of those things or improve those things that we are measuring in our sheep operation. But a lot of those still go back to being a savvy sheep producer. And if we're in the seed stock business, you can't just look at a piece of paper. You have to put the performance into animals that deliver a product oriented animal at the end of the day.
Becky had a comment here in the comments section. Do you see NSIP playing a part in flocks that use terminal sires on NSIP enrolled ewes anytime in the future? I think if we're using terminals, I'm assuming they're probably NSIP terminal sires on NSIP. Oh, are you talking about a crossbreeding program, Becky?
Yes, that's what I'm talking about. I know
Okay.
there's always been an issue with the hyper vigor and all that, and whether lamb plan can calculate those into useful data. So I just didn't know where NSIP
Sure.
was with that.
You know, and I don't know how deep off into the weeds I want to get on that one, but I mean, what I would say is that anything's possible into the future. You know, the Simmental Association has a program called Total Herd Enrollment, and that's where even cattle that are percentages of Simmental, they've got to be over a certain percentage, I believe, but they want you to enroll all of those cattle into that program because all of that data does help. And so I'm not going to say that it's something that we're going to see within the next year or two, but I don't see why it's not something that we couldn't discuss. particularly being that some of these larger cattle breeds are able to utilize that at the same time. You know, I don't know if we'll be able. I understand from a hybrid vigor standpoint of, you know, at what point then, if you start to keep those crossbreds and are utilizing those crossbreds and trying to put them within NSIP, how does that work? I'm not sure, but there's certainly got to be a. I would think that, you know, let's say for example, if you're a Suffolk producer that's running NSIP bucks over polypay ewes, I think that's a pretty standard practice in the Midwest. You know, there's got to be an adjustment factor if those are, for the most part, purebred polypay ewes, and this is a purebred Suffolk buck. Certainly, there's an adjustment factor that we can make on that to account for that hybrid vigor.
So sheep genetics doesn't have it in their software to enter a heterosis impact. In the U.S. sheep industry, we haven't ever it's been very rare that there's any breeds we figured out the amount of heterosis in different breeding examples. It takes a fair amount of work to actually get that. Depending on how you use it, that hybrid vigor may or not really affect the EBV that much, but it'd be take a lot of research to be able to implement that. You know, I'd much rather see better software or whatever to really get at that, or get larger flocks, you know, that we could then get the data to be able to calculate the heterosis. But at this point, Lamb Plan's not set up to handle it.
Sure.
Australia does have larger flocks, and they just ignore it and take the EBV as it is.
I see.
You know, so, which isn't the right way either. So
right.
So we would, I guess my follow-up question would be, you discussed encouraging commercial breeders to use NSIP rams. If we're going to encourage a commercial breeder to use an NSIP ram, what's to say that commercial flock is crossbred already? Like, if you're going to encourage that, how are you going to stop if Lamb Plan can't analyze the data? How would that all work? Because
I'm not really encouraging the commercial flocks to enroll their sheep, all of those resulting hybrid lambs within Lamb Plan. What I'm encouraging is commercial producers to become more like what I have traditionally been most of my career as an end user of NSIP, utilize, you know, and so by bringing in more commercial flocks, utilizing these NSIP rams, I'm looking at that strictly from a standpoint for us seed stock producers for increasing demand for our rams. And so if there's increased demand for the rams, hopefully that raises the prices across the board for all of the purebred bucks that are here in NSIP. And then we can pull more purebred producers in to help meet that growing demand. That's what when I'm driving ahead here, talking about looking at this from a bottom up type situation. That's how I'm looking at commercial flocks utilizing NSIP bucks, is to create hybrid commercial sheep, not necessarily sheep that are going to be re-enrolled in NSIP.
Okay. So if I were to retain like a Texel Katahdin cross ewes as lambs, entering them in Pedigree Master and submitting that data as they get a breeding age and have lambs themselves, that would skew my numbers, or would that?
But it sounds like, I mean, and maybe Jim Morgan here has a better explanation on that than I do.
But the appropriate way to do it is to run those half-bred, the 50% ewes in one contemporary group, 75% grews in another management group.
Okay.
And you're 100% in a third.
Okay.
If you've got enough ewes, that works. But if you only have 5 crossbred ewes of the same age that are 50%, you won't get any EBV, any significant differences back on those ewes to know which of those. because which of those are the better sheep, or which ones grew faster, which of that, cetera. So it's hard to do unless you really have 20. I'd say you would need 20 ewes that are 50% that are the same age from the same lamb crop.
And I guess,
And that-
Becky, with what you're trying to do, are you trying to get those sheep to grade up to 87.5 and pass a hair coat?
No, I mean,
Okay.
no, not with the Texels, because I don't register them, and I don't plan on using them for anything but terminal sires. But I guess it comes down to, like, I have commercial Katahdins that aren't registered. If they don't, let's say they don't shed well. So I have a couple that don't shed well, but they are excellent producers. So they have a purpose here on my farm. But they've been enrolled in NSIP for a while. I guess I just don't know what to do with the lambs, and like to show that they are producing, or should I just X them off of my whole pedigree master? I'm just not sure. This is probably a whole other topic we can talk another time about.
Yeah, I mean, it's a tangent, but not necessarily a bad one. I think you kind of answered the question there yourself. If you've got the space to keep those commercial ewes around, I wouldn't spend the time collecting the data on them to enter into Pedigree Master, but you can still keep your phenotypic data to make sure those ewes are doing a good job, like your other commercial ewes are.
Okay.
And the percentage used will skew the data some in your flock and in NSIP in general, unless you put them in a different contemporary group.
Okay.
And we keep in mind, it takes good purebreds to make good crossbreds. So if you can find and select those individuals going into the crossbreeding program based on favorable EBVs for whatever traits you desire, cross those, and then you're crossing, in theory, the best of the best, and then you're going to add on hybrid vigor on top of that. So if you do that, and then you can go in and keep those phenotypic records and set whatever thresholds you need to set in terms of culling criteria, that can make a lot of progress just in and of itself without trying to overcomplicate it. And then if you really want them to be in an NSIP, like Dr. Morgan said, you can just code them in a separate contemporary group to try to account for some of that.
Okay, because I mean, I can analyze a lot of the data with FarmWorks, so that works too with the Shearwell program.
Great. Any other last minute questions? If not, just want to thank David again for hopping in here and sharing a little bit about himself and putting himself in front of everybody to just answer questions out of the blue. So very much appreciated. And I know we're all excited to be working with you in the future. So
Well, thanks for
have a
having
good
me,
night.
Cam.
Thanks.
We'll see you
Thank
next
you.
month.
Thank you, Jim. Appreciate the insight.